as promised, we are comparing the polymer clays from the two most popular brands, Super Sculpey, which was specifically invented for doll making, and Cernit. We will go through all the pros and cons, look at how they are similar and how they differ. I bought two packs in approximately the same color. Let's start by examining the packaging. First of all, the Cernit pack features dolls by one of my favorite artists, Laura Scatolini, who sculpts highly detailed, incredibly realistic children. She's an Italian artist. Meanwhile, the packaging of Living Doll by Super Sculpey has a simpler looking doll. Now, let's check the weight. The Super Sculpey pack is 454 grams. The Cernit pack is 500 grams, slightly more. Price. I bought the clay at an art supply store. Of course, prices may vary. They can be different on Amazon, in various stores, or in my case in the art shop. The Super Sculpey pack cost almost 18 euros, while Cernit pack was cheaper, around 14 euros. Now technical specs. Both clays bake at 130 degrees Celsius, so the final baking temperature is identical. Alright, let's continue our research. Time to open these packs and see what the clay looks like inside. Opening them up, both packs. To keep things fair, I specifically bought fresh clay so we get a clear comparison. This one is Super Sculpey. How does the surface feel? They're approximately the same. I cannot say one is noticeably denser than the other, or that one is more translucent. Now about color. I'll just say this based on my experience. These clays are designed specifically for dolls. Super Sculpey only offers 3 shades for sculpting dolls: beige, the darkest, light fresh, and another pinkish flesh tone. Cernit has a much wider range of doll-specific skin tones, and its color palette is very diverse. The shades can be mixed together, and it is perfectly safe to do so within the same brand. Cernit offers a clay specifically for dark skin tones, as well as more yellowish, more pinkish, and translucent options. So in terms of color variety, Cernit is a more interesting material than Super Sculpey. However, I should briefly mention that Super Sculpey recently introduced an espresso shade for dark skin dolls, but for now, it's the only one until you mix it. Now, let's keep going. Let's cut a piece and take a closer look. We'll knead it and see how it feels. First, a piece of Super Sculpey. Let's take a piece of clay. Cernit, even now, you can see it's harder to cut, but the sliced part is slightly darker. However, colors may vary, and that's completely fine. I specifically chose similar shades. Now let's check how oily it appears on the cut surface. And now let's compare how it softens. First, we need Super Sculpey. Remember, polymer clay is a material that becomes softer with the warmth of your hands. Clean surgeon-like hands for the best results. And in a regular household oven, it hardens. To work with it properly, we need to knead it very well. It's actually softening quite nicely to a pliable state. The clay should be thoroughly conditioned. It shouldn't break, but rather stretch. Right now, you can see it still breaks. It needs to be very, very pliable before we start work with it. And that's why it needs to be well kneaded. How easy is it to soften the clay? Well, it depends on how warm your hands are. If your hands are hot and your blood pressure is high, sometimes the clay almost melts in your hands. Right now, as I knead it, it's becoming soft and stretchy, reaching the comfortable working consistency. I can't help but brag a little. My fingers are well trained, so I have no trouble kneading this clay, and it feels quite nice in the hand. I hope you won't have any trouble either. If the clay is not properly kneaded, has been stored for a long time, or breaks too easily, it can lead to what is known as fish scale. Polymer clay has a tendency to form these scales, tiny air bubbles trapped inside that, when heated, try to rise to the surface. This results in either light spots or air bubbles appearing on the surface. To prevent this, the clay must be very soft and highly pliable. Right now, it's stretched quite well. Once it reaches this state, it no longer changes its properties and becomes a good pliable material that is comfortable to sculpt with. Well, that's about it. Now we have no more breaks on the cracks on the clay. We can stretch it and it doesn't tear. It's now stretching properly. At this point, the clay has reached the necessary pliability for working. This was Super Sculpey. Now let's move on to Cernit. Right away, I'll say that kneading Cernit is significantly harder. It requires much more effort. Even for me, a small piece takes noticeably longer to soften it. It's much more difficult. For some, this is a benefit, a good workout for the hands. For others, it can feel like a burden. To knead it properly, you need to squeeze harder and hold it in your fingers longer to warm it up. This clay requires more effort. However, in the end, it also becomes pliable, and since this batch is fresh, it's softened a bit faster. From my experience, Cernit is initially very difficult to knead, but at some point it suddenly becomes too soft and starts melting in your hands. If you are working with a large piece, hold it by the fingertips, because otherwise it will keep softening too much, making it harder to sculpt. I also noticed that once Cernit is fully kneaded, it becomes very pliable. When comparing it to Super Sculpey, once Super Sculpey reaches its most pliable state, it remains stable, it doesn't get too soft, and stays easier to sculpt with. But Cernit keeps getting softer in your hands, becoming too mushy for comfortable sculpting. So you always need to monitor when it starts getting too soft and let it cool down before continuing. At the same time, it must be kneaded to stay pliable, otherwise it will be hardened. But while kneading, Cernit has noticeably higher elasticity. Look at how it stretches. Just like this. With Super Sculpey, it's impossible. Yeah. It's much firmer and would tear. No matter how much I knead it, I wouldn't be able to stretch it this way. Rookie surgeon, don't be afraid to start. You are not operating on real patient. Making your own ball-jointed doll sounds complicated, until you realize you don't have to figure it all out alone. My free lesson gives you a foolproof starting point, the exact template I use, a list of materials, and a step-by-step guide to get you going. No guesswork, no frustration. If you have ever thought, I would love to make a doll but I have no idea where to start, this is it. Click the link, grab the template, and let's make something amazing. Just like every surgeon, doll artists have to start somewhere, and I'll send you an exclusive invite to our global doll making club session this Saturday. Now it's time to partially cure and test our clay in the oven. What is semi-bake like partial curing? Polymer clay hardens with heat. The final baking temperature is 130 degrees Celsius, but it also solidifies at lower temperatures, like 110 degrees Celsius. At this stage, the clay becomes firm enough to continue work with. You can cut it, carve it, or add more clay. This process can be repeated as many times as needed. So now let's test partial curing and see the results. So we are baking it partially, not to full curing temperature, but only to 110 degrees Celsius. Let's make a small test ball. This one is Super Sculpey. Sculpting with raw Cernit is more difficult than with Super Sculpey because its pliability keeps changing. Super Sculpey is much more stable. Once it becomes soft, you can work with it consistently. With Cernit, you always need to monitor its condition. Now we place the test pieces into the oven at 110 degrees Celsius for 20 minutes. Important baking rules for polymer clay. The timer starts only after the oven reaches 110 degrees Celsius. Always place clay into a cold oven and let it heat up gradually. Once baked, turn off the oven and let the pieces cool inside before taking them out. Let's see what results we get after this test. So I have taken the pieces out of the oven. The first partial curing is done, and now we are analyzing the results. The first noticeable thing is how much Cernit has changed in color. This is characteristic of this clay. Even with partial curing, its color shifts significantly. This can be misleading when adding fresh clay to pre-baked pots, and the difference in the tone might be distracting during sculpting. Meanwhile, Super Sculpey's color remained almost the same, with barely any change. Another thing I noticed is that Cernit developed a slightly oily, glossy sheen, almost pearlescent. This is not necessarily good or bad. It's just how the material behaves. Additionally, it has a slight rubbery feel, which is another property of this clay. Super Sculpey, on the other hand, is denser and more rigid. It doesn't bend, has no shine, and remains matte. I consider this a plus because it gives a more natural, realistic look. As for Cernit, it feels more plastic-like than rubber-like. Both pieces have a few tiny scales, light spots on the surface. This happened because I probably didn't knead the clay well enough. I should have conditioned it more thoroughly to avoid these imperfections. Now let's see how we can work with these pieces. Let's try cutting a section. Cernit cuts quite easily and has slightly oily feel. In somewhat resembles wax, a very dense wax. Super Sculpey, on the other hand, is firmer and harder to cut. It feels drier and has not of the waxy effect. However, it still cuts fairly easily. From experience, I can also say that if Super Sculpey is underbaked, for example, if it was baked at 100 degrees instead 110 degrees, it will become very brittle and crumbly. Cernit, however, doesn't behave this way. Its waxy surface remains stable even if slightly underbaked. Now let's see how we can add new clay to these pieces. Let's see how the clay behaves when sculpting, specifically when we need to add new parts. First, we knead the pieces. Let's start with Cernit. For example, if we need to add an ear, we sculpt it and detach it. Blending it is more difficult. Cernit also has a more fluid consistency, which makes it harder to sculpt fine details. Since it's a softer and more fluid material, delicate elements can shift during baking. That said, I believe that there are no good or bad materials, only the ones that suit you or don't. We also need to keep in mind that when working with sculpture, the color of the clay can vary significantly. This can be visually confusing, making it harder to judge the final look. Now let's try sculpting with Super Sculpey. It's much more pliable, and blending is significantly easier, many times easier, compared to Cernit. Super Sculpey stretches more easily, whereas Cernit is stiffer. If Cernit is over-kneaded and becomes too soft, it starts to lose structure and struggles to hold fine details. For this reason, Super Sculpey is easier to work with, especially for beginners. That's why I usually recommend it. Now let's move on to the final bake and see how both clays react at 130 degrees Celsius. So the final bake is done. Let's analyze the results. Visually, you can already see that some of fine details slightly melted. Cernit has a more waxy appearance and doesn't hold tiny details very well. Its color changed significantly, several shades darker, which is quite noticeable. In contrast, Super Sculpey remained almost unchanged, becoming just slightly darker by one tone. Cernit also retained a waxy shine and a somewhat plastic-like texture. Cernit has a slight translucency and a subtle shine, while Super Sculpey remains fully matte. Now let's test the strength. Cernit is extremely durable. It bends without breaking. Super Sculpey, on the other hand, cannot be bent this way. At the thickness, Cernit is very strong. I cannot break it with my fingers. Of course, a thinner piece would be easier to snap, but at this size, even with force, I cannot break it at all. Cernit is also significantly heavier and nearly impossible to break. So, Cernit is fundamentally stronger than the Super Sculpey. That said, there are no good or bad materials. It's all about choosing what works best for you. There is also an option to mix these two clays together, as they have the same baking temperature. This combination reduces Cernit's plastic-like appearance while maintaining its durability. The mixing ratio is up to you. You can go 50-50 or adjust the balance with more Super Sculpey and less Cernit. There is plenty of room for experimentation. The biggest advantage of Cernit is its exceptional strength. It's slightly harder to work with. But I encourage you to experiment, test, and explore. If you have your own unique experience with these clays, feel free to share it in the comments. And that concludes our Cernit vs Super Sculpey test with an open-ended conclusion.